Hey everyone, welcome back to Life Single Review. You know, sometimes we think strength means never slowing down. That love and responsibility demand we keep going, no matter how tired we are. But what if that kind of strength is what slowly breaks us? Remember Day? The man who worked through headaches, who pushed himself to finish one last task at the dock, dreaming of a simple wedding with Huyen. He looked fine, didn't he? Strong, calm, kind. But there was something behind those quiet eyes, something fragile. What if the pain he ignored wasn't just exhaustion? What if, while saving others, his own body was quietly crying for help? Today we'll take a look at a story most people missed. Not about love or sacrifice alone, but about what happens when kindness pushes the human heart beyond its limits. The morning after that long, chaotic day, Dee returned to the dock. The sun was sharp, cutting through the mist, and the air smelled of wet metal and salt. He moved slower than usual, but no one really noticed. He'd always been the quiet one. He smiled at the crew, lifted his toolbox, and got to work. Every hit of the hammer echoed through his skull. His temples throbbed with each metallic strike, and sweat dripped down his face faster than usual. Still, he told himself, just a few more hours, just one more board, one more nail. People around him joked about lunch, about the weather, about their families. Day didn't join in. He couldn't. The world was starting to blur at the edges. His heart beat too fast. His breath came in shallow bursts. But pride, or maybe guilt, kept him standing. He thought of Huyen, of the wedding he'd been saving for, of the ring he still hadn't bought. He remembered her laughter, soft like the sound of rice swaying in the wind. That image, simple and pure, pushed him to keep going. Then, just as he bent to lift a heavy plank, the sound of the world went silent. The dock spun. His legs gave way. The last thing he saw was the blur of sunlight breaking across the water before everything went dark. When he opened his eyes again, the world was white. The sterile kind of white that smells like antiseptic and whispers. Machines hummed around him. A nurse leaned over. "Can you hear me?" she asked. Dee blinked, nodded faintly. His voice came out cracked. "Where am I?" "You're at the clinic. You collapsed at work," she said gently. "Your body gave out. Too much work, too little rest." Later that afternoon, Huyen burst through the door. Her face was pale, hair loose, hands trembling as she reached for him. "You scared me," she said, voice breaking. Dee tried to smile, but his lips barely moved. "It's just exhaustion," he whispered. "I'll be fine." The doctor stepped in then, holding a clipboard. "He's lucky," the doctor said, in that tone that's meant to reassure, but only adds weight. Blood pressure was dangerously low. He's been running on nothing but adrenaline. He needs to rest. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Now. Dee listened, half ashamed, half grateful. He'd spent years working without thinking of rest, as if his worth depended on how much pain he could hide. Now, his body had made the decision for him. That night, Huyen sat beside him, holding his hand while he slept. The flickering light from the hallway cast long shadows on the floor. She whispered, more to herself than to him, "You always take care of everyone else, Day. But who's going to take care of you?" Days passed. Dee slowly regained his strength. He watched the world through the window, the workers hauling nets, the birds landing on the riverbank. He missed it, but for the first time he didn't ache to be out there. Maybe this was what slowing down felt like. When the doctor finally said he could go home, Huyen smiled for real, though her eyes were still rimmed with worry. She wrapped her scarf around his neck before they left the hospital. "Promise me you'll rest," she said. He nodded, squeezing her hand. "I promise." Back home, the air smelled like warm rice and fresh soil. Huyen had prepared soup, simple with ginger and tofu. Day sat by the window, watching the evening settle over the fields. Everything looked softer now. The horizon, the light, even the silence. He looked down at his hands, the same hands that had once lifted beams, built boats, and helped strangers. They were trembling slightly. Maybe, he thought, kindness isn't just about saving others. Maybe it's also about not breaking yourself in the process. That night, Huyen caught him staring out the window again. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "That I've spent my life trying to be strong, but maybe strength means something different now." She tilted her head. "Different how?" He looked at her, eyes tired but soft. "Strength is knowing when to stop before you lose yourself." Huyen didn't answer. She just leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. The crickets sang outside, and somewhere far away, the river murmured under the moonlight. The next morning, Day woke early. The sun was rising over the rice fields, casting a golden haze through the curtains. He felt lighter, weaker, but somehow more alive. The pain in his head had dulled, replaced by a quiet awareness, a reminder that he was still here, still breathing. He poured a cup of tea, took a slow sip, and whispered, "Thank you." He wasn't sure if he meant it for the doctor, for Huyen, or for life itself. Maybe all three. That's the theory Life Single Review developed, the day Dee's body gave up before his heart ever would. A quiet fall, a soft return, and a lesson written not in words, but in silence. After returning home, Dee's life found a gentler rhythm. He still woke up early, but not to rush to the dock anymore. Instead, he sat on the porch, sipping tea, while the mist curled over the fields. The sound of Huyen preparing breakfast drifted from the kitchen, the clinking of bowls, the hiss of boiling water. Sometimes he would help her with small things, peeling vegetables, mending a basket, feeding the chickens. These were things he used to think were meaningless, too slow for a man trying to build a future. But now, every moment felt heavier with meaning. Huyen watched him closely, though she never said much. She noticed how he pressed his hand against his temple every now and then, or how he paused mid-step to steady himself. But she didn't scold him anymore. She simply stayed near, quietly, like the air after rain. One afternoon, while they sat outside watching Bibi chase butterflies, Dee turned to her. "You know," he said, his voice calm, but a little shaky. "I used to think rest was weakness, that if I stopped, I'd fall behind." Huyen smiled faintly, her eyes on the horizon. "And now? Now I think stopping might be the only way to keep going." Huyen laughed softly, that kind of laugh that hides tears. "You sound like an old man already." Dee chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe I've finally started listening to life instead of fighting it." The sun dipped lower, turning the field gold. Huyen leaned closer, resting her hand on his. "You scared me, you know," she whispered. "I know," Day replied. "I scared myself too." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Not empty, but full of everything they'd been through. The exhaustion, the fear, the gratitude. It was a silence that spoke louder than any promise. As the wind rustled the leaves, Day looked toward the dock in the distance. It was just a faint outline now, swallowed by the dusk. "I miss it," he said quietly. "The sound of the waves, the feeling of working with my hands." Huyen nodded. "You'll go back when you're ready. But for now, maybe life's asking you to stay still." He smiled. That tired, peaceful smile that only comes when someone finally lets go. "Maybe," he said. "Staying still is also a kind of work." They sat there until the sky turned violet and the first stars began to appear. The sound of Bibi's laughter faded into the distance. The world felt slower now, slower, but fuller. And for the first time in a long while, Day didn't feel like he was running out of time. He just felt home. The next morning, the world seemed new again. Not because anything had changed, but because Dee finally noticed it. He woke before sunrise and stepped outside, the earth still damp from the night dew. The smell of soil, the hum of distant crickets, the cool air. Everything felt alive. For once, he wasn't in a rush to fix, to build, to finish. He simply stood there breathing. Huyen found him a few minutes later, holding a small cup of tea. "You're up early again," she said softly. Day smiled. "Couldn't sleep. The morning feels too quiet to waste." She handed him the cup. "Quiet is good," she said. "You used to hate it." He nodded, eyes on the horizon. "I used to mistake silence for emptiness, but maybe silence is where we actually heal." The two of them sat together as the sun rose, its light spreading slowly over the fields like spilled honey. Dee's hand brushed against hers, and for a moment, he thought of everything that had led him here. The dock, the fall, the hospital, the promises he almost couldn't keep. He realized that the pain had never really left. It had just softened, like a scar, learning how to stop hurting. "I was so afraid," Day admitted, voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid that if I stopped working, I'd stop mattering." Huyen turned to him. "You matter because of who you are, not what you do." He met her eyes and smiled faintly. "Then I guess I've been looking at it backward all this time." The sound of Bibi's laughter broke the stillness as the child came running, holding a small flower in her hand. "Look, Uncle Day, for you." Dee bent down, accepting it with a grin. "Thank you, sweetheart." He looked at the flower for a long moment, fragile, soft, but standing tall. Maybe that was what strength really looked like. Later, as the family gathered for breakfast, Huyen poured tea, the aroma of ginger filling the room. Day's laughter joined theirs, quiet, genuine, unforced, the kind of sound that says, "I'm still here." And outside, the field shimmered with sunlight. The world kept moving, slow but steady, just like him. He had once lost his balance trying to save everyone else, but now, in the small rhythms of daily life, he was learning to live again. Sometimes kindness means giving your strength to others, but other times, kindness means giving yourself permission to rest, to heal, to breathe, to begin again. Dee's story lingers, not because of the pain, but because of what it teaches us. We live in a world that praises endurance, that tells us to keep going even when our hearts whisper, "Enough." But sometimes, real courage isn't found in the fight. It's found in the pause. Day reminds us that kindness, while beautiful, can also be heavy. He gave his time, his strength, and his compassion freely, until his own body began to fade. Yet through that fall, he discovered something rare, the grace of slowing down. Maybe that's what love truly is. Not just about building a life together, but learning how to rest together, to stop before breaking, to breathe before burning out. So if this story touched you, take a moment today for yourself. Rest, even if the world tells you not to. And if you felt something watching Dee's quiet transformation, share this story. Leave a comment below. Tell us what you think strength really means. Thank you for watching Life Single Review, where every simple act, every silent moment still has something to say.